know is, you mess with me, you got problems. That's all I know. You're gonna want to be comfortable today.
With the 11th pick in the 2011 NFL Draft, the Houston Texans select J.J. Watt, defensive end, Wisconsin.
Batted down and intercepted. Intercepted by J.J. Watt. Touchdown, Houston. J.J. Watt, the rookie from Wisconsin, who began his college career at Central Michigan, left delivering pizza. He said, "What am I doing with my life?" Walked on at Wisconsin, became an All-American, an academic All-Big Ten, and scoring a touchdown. J.J. Watt devours Tannehill.
And Rodgers under pressure, and down he'll go. And that's J.J. Watt.
Here comes Watt. J.J. Watt. Who cares if you lose your head? Back to play action. Luck trying to circle. Thrown down by Watt. Standing at the goal line and sacked. And it's J.J. Watt. He has time. Knocked away and recovered by Watt.
2014 AP Defensive Player of the Year is
J.J. Watt. J.J. Watt.
Texans coming to the place. Manuel intercepted by Watt. And the big fella lumbering inside the 40. No one is going to catch Watt into the end zone for the pick six. Incredible. 79 yards on the return from J.J. Watt.
Because I want you guys to hear it directly from me. I want to speak directly to you in the city of Houston. I have sat down with the McNair family, and I have asked them for my release, and we have mutually agreed to part ways at this time.
And welcome to another episode of the Turn Up For What podcast, talking your Houston Texans straight from the Great British Isles in a week where the club president resigns, another character coach is hired, and the departure of the greatest player in franchise history who's released from his contract, all in another week in the life of the Houston Texans in 2021, where they seem to not be able to hit the self-destruct button and keep taking a step back with every decision, every turn. I think if you take the Jamie Roots point of view, first and foremost, of a guy who's been with the team since day one, a guy who called himself basically a son to the founder, Bob McNair, Cal's father. And if you ever wanted to see the power rankings or the strength of grip on the decision making of this franchise, this is just yet another example, if not the clearest example there has been of Jack Easterby's vice-like grip over Cal McNair. This comes down to effectively a process that was run in the off-season to hire a GM and head coach through Corn Ferry. Cal McNair worked with, said openly that Jamie Roots would play a huge role in that, and it would not be Jack Easterby. That was proven not to be right. Just one of many public outings that he's spoken, and quite the opposite has happened. But there was definitely a relationship there, and with himself and Omar Khan, and that was the guy he wanted. Obviously, Easterby hijacks the hire, brings in Caserio, paste and copy of our problems, and we're no further forward this off-season. The fallout from that was effectively Jamie Roots wanting out. He's now decided now to release that information, and for whatever reason deemed this to be the right time. A guy who built this franchise from effectively nothing in terms of the operations on the business side, and he'll be missed. I think he was I had some personal dealings with him, and a great guy, and by all accounts very courteous and engaged in people, I think. And he's basically, and it was said, and it was outlined by John McClain on Radio 610, that Easterby's meddling was another one that he basically, you could put two and two together, but Easterby's meddling was enough for him. If he wasn't here, he'd still be here. McClain said that explicitly, and you got to think that there's been a point where and there's been a lot of discussion about people going to Cal saying, look, what is going on here? Why are things going so badly? Why are you letting this guy make these decisions? And you got to think Roots has probably done that at some point, because he would have, like all of us, be able to see blatantly where this is going and this nosedive that this team continues to take. And you've got to think he's gone to Cal as well and said, I don't like the direction this team's going. I don't like how the process went in the general manager and head coaching hire in the off-season. I need to leave. And I can guarantee you he will have interjected at some point in the off-season to try and steer it in the right direction. And he would have been ignored, and I think that's probably the only way you can lose somebody at that level is just by letting them feel like they've got no input. And, it's a similar theme, isn't it? I think with our quarterback as well, felt there was more than a justification for them to have input, and they weren't given it. They were ignored, and a different direction was taken. So in a week where Dylan Thompson was hired from Detroit, character coach there comes as director of player development. Now, of course, and it was incredibly obvious, a long time mentor-mentoree relationship with Jack Easterby. He comes in two things about that. One is, how on earth does anybody expect anyone in the building to trust him when that's been the biggest issue, a toxic culture? We bring him in to try and correct that. You think, well, if he's got a track record of correcting just that very thing, then yeah, you can understand it. But then you look where he's come from, and it's quite the opposite. From Detroit, where you saw when the Darius Slade trade was made, when he went to Philadelphia, he wanted out of Detroit, arguably one of their best players on that roster, and he talked about the interactions and the discussions with Matt Patricia and the way in which he tried to run that football program, alienated players that didn't want to play for him, and the results on the field spoke for themselves. So you're bringing a guy over from a culture on a football program. You don't have that blanket of New England success, and as we have all seen, Tom Brady's success rather than New England. But there's no way in which you can sell that move other than Easterby's game power. So within 2 days last week, we saw the Texans just make further nods and give us all further clarity that this terrible journey that we're on to hit rock bottom, which I still don't think we've hit that yet, Easterby's very much in the driving seat and making all these calls, and I don't know what it's going to take to make anybody realise. But when Jamie Roots, was close to his Cal as a brother, has been reported, he is now lost effectively to Easterby. O'Brien, a guy who was given all the power more than he ever should have done by Cal, he was ousted by Easterby. Brian Gain, and how many people were we going to continue to add to this list? Because the issue is Nick Caserio going to be added to that list at some point? Because I think if you look at the pattern of Easterby's behaviour, he chokes everything off in the background and lets somebody fail. And I would argue, and lets them fail in the public eye, you'd argue that Caserio so far has not done a great job here. I think the head coaching hire is, we've hardly talked about it on this show, but it doesn't deserve being talked about because it is in itself a patch-up job, and as I said, it's got something very temporary about it. And only way the Houston Texans could justify somebody they brought in to correct their mess rather than bringing in somebody who's here to be the best coach and get the best out of his players. That's the role for the team, not what they've described David Culley as. But you add that sort of head coaching hire in, all the moves made directly related to Easterby, and you just got to think Caserio is being undermined. And I think the only way you were ever going to sell this or look for positives or look for a way forward in this off-season and how they've pieced this new regime together, which certainly doesn't look like it's going to deliver any success. So therefore you'd suggest it probably won't. And unless something radically changes, it looks like it's going to be a 2 to 3 year rebuild. Everybody keeps talking about that, but I think it's more than the possibility that we just sit and dwell in it in the dormant outer Hebrides of mediocrity, and it feels like that's just the future written for us already. It seemed like the future in terms of the moves and losing all these players, it was going to finally leak its way onto the field and we wouldn't be a very good football team. And I think when the front office structure crumbles, or it certainly looks shaky at best in terms of its foundations, in terms of the type of people you've got and the decisions they make. They all add up, and I think we continue to go backwards off the field. I just don't think that'll allow us to flourish on it. But Caserio, his role has to be questioned. How much power does he have? How much autonomy does he have? This was going to be the hardest job he probably could have ever have taken. There probably isn't a harder job in the league to try and correct this, considering the Watson angle, considering the talent, and considering the disconnect between fans, etc. There's so many things wrong with this Houston Texans organisation, and his task is to fix it. But I don't really think I think he's capable. Whether he'll be given the autonomy to do that, and how much Easterby meddles in the background and actually detracts from what Caserio is trying to do, because that's the circus, and they think it's an easy step forward as if he was to leave. But it's very clear from the Dylan Thompson hiring, from Jamie Roots leaving, that Caserio has less, if not at very best, equal power to Easterby. But I put out an article on podcasttexans.com this week, and it talks, and they're often saying do the right thing. Dylan Thompson said that, it's Cal said that, he's obviously picked that up from Easterby. And Caserio said that around about way in his last press conference, but we've only got one Friday and we'll deal with it and just take it one step at a time. And I get that mentality, and I do understand that. There's definitely a lack of plan here, a lack of guile, and I think no more shown by the JJ Watt release. And it was obvious from a year ago when he didn't renew his contract, he was going into a final year with $17.5 million cap hit, all of it non-guarantees. There's something that was going to have to give, and I think the fact that they didn't re-sign him or extend him or restructure him last off-season to keep him in Houston meant that this was already kind of written. And you saw his frustration last year in the media conferences, and look, he knows, and he said that I don't want to be involved in a rebuild, and as I said, I question even their ability to rebuild. But these guys have seen, if you go back and watch some of the highlights in a phenomenal career, right up there with Reggie White and Lawrence Taylor in terms of the best defensive player of all time, and Aaron Donald's obviously in that conversation as well. But the 2014, 2015 and 2013 seasons was some of the most dominant football anyone's ever played, and it was like watching a quarterback on the field, on defense, looking at the formation, where was he lined up, because you knew he was going to do something. And you've got to wonder, if the injuries hadn't have piled up, how great could he have been? Or did he just do so much to his body to get it in a place to perform at that level that something had to give, and he got every ounce out of his God-given talents that he could. And he's a great story, JJ, and I've been critical of the guy, but I think when you see some of all there is a lot of sort of brand created, fabricated, very PR savvy kind of guy who puts himself across in a specific way, and he was like the ultimate footballer, the ultimate marketer's dream in terms of the traditional thought and archetype of what you'd want a defensive end, what you want the leader of your franchise to be. There's been so many great moments from him, but I think he did a lot away from the field, which I think probably goes unnoticed, and he did a lot of things where he didn't want the limelight to be on that, and there's been a lot of stories come out about JJ and the kind of guy he was, and I think sometimes, did he come across corny and a bit fake in the media as he was trying to grow the brand, when the brand hit a certain level. But I think if you go back to some of the stuff when he first got here and when the stuff he continued to do away from the limelight, I think you can't probably question his intentions of a guy, but just a hell of a football player. Interested to see where he ends up. I think if Green Bay's an option, he'll definitely land there, but it's going to be hard to see him in another uniform, just like it was Hopkins, just like it was Clowney, just like it was DJ Reader, Kareem Jackson, all these great players that have come and left this building, and potentially Watson adds to the list this off-season the way it's trending. But it's certainly a sad day to lose a player like that, an unbelievable talent who just wrecked games, wrecked offensive game plans, wrecked offensive linemen's careers. and just statistically racked up some of the best years and should have won MVP in 2014 if it hadn't been, a bona fide quarterback award. But what a season he had that year with the touchdowns and all the plays that he put together. And he could do so much on the field. He came as eligible receiver, as a tight end, caught scores. It's some of his biggest plays. I now remember the first time I ever saw him live in Dallas, and there was a tackle for loss, and the way he got up and the way he celebrated, it was impossible to miss him on the field. And I think he probably lost some of that through injury as well, and I think some of the downward pressure on his mentality and the current situation that we've just talked about in Houston probably took some of the joy away from his game, and he definitely wasn't, certainly last season, as effective as he'd been, but he wasn't playing with anybody. And I think when you go back and watch all those highlights and I think that obviously the Cincinnati one, where he announced himself to the world as having great ball skills, former tight end when he was on at Michigan, and then he walked on at Wisconsin. The Buffalo one stands out where he picked off E.J. Manuel, takes it all the way to the house, 79 yards. There was the one against the Colts when they tried to mount a comeback. If it hadn't been for the Andrew Johnson fumble, then they might have won that game as well on the final drive. And there was so many great plays, so many sacks, so many game changing sacks, so many ones on third down. If you look when that game in Denver, when they finally beat Denver in 2012, when they should have really been a contender in 2011 as well. If Mario Williams has stayed healthy, would have had an even better season in his rookie year. There's a lot of ifs and buts, I think, but certainly the things that stand out when you go and watch all those plays is that there's a huge difference in crowd noise and the way in which people have become disenfranchised with this football team in Houston. And I've noticed that in person, but when you go back and watch some of the old highlights, how loud the crowd is on defence, it's just not been like that for a good number of years now. The players that he played with, whether it been a couple of games with Mario Williams before he was injured, but Connor Barwin, Brooks Reed, Antonio Smith, Whitney Merciless at his prime, Jadeveon Clowney, got solid guys like Errol Mitchell, DJ Reader in the middle. Just a long list of great players that he played with, and there was some stats out there about how much he was double and triple teamed last year, and I think ultimately you could be one of the greatest players on any side of the ball. When we saw that with Watson, you could just be negated by the fact you're not got enough around you. And I think that was probably one of the biggest reasons why he was gone. And you think, is there an alternative situation that could have been created where he's still here and he finished his career and he isn't going to finalise his career in the final years and go and chase a ring somewhere else? And there is, but I think the problem is with Houston that that situation came about where he wanted to leave because there was a 2 to 3 year period of so many bad decisions when there should have just been one clean cut regime change, new GM, new head coach, and it probably would have put us on a very different path. And it's tough for many people to see what goal. He's probably the reason why there's a whole generation of fans and Hard Knocks and all this kind of stuff being the face of the league for a number of years. They're probably the reason why they ever support this team. Might be the reason why they listen to this podcast. Might be the reason why they ever got into the National Football League. And he's done so much for Houston. Obviously, you can't say enough about his off-field accolades in terms of what he did for the city after Hurricane Harvey, and that was a really hard time. And you saw the after effects of that for long, and still some people still are feeling that. When he came out on that field in 2017 with the flag, that was a big moment. I think a lot of people there really felt that as a poignant moment. And then to get injured a couple of weeks later against Kansas City was probably the beginning of the end. The 2018 season where he got 16 sacks, he looked like getting back to his best, but then 2019 gets the torn pec, when again he was playing really well at the start of the season but didn't quite look the same player. But again, losing talent around him, it's too hard to judge. And look, if he isn't asked to play as many snaps, and that's his biggest flaw, was he played too many snaps, not used situationally. He can continue to play in this league for another 3 or 4 years and be a really effective player if he's used situationally, second and long, third down, obvious pass rushing ability, and he can continue to use that. And I think over the years he really developed his pass rush moves. He continued to reinvent himself and get better when he lost that first step a bit, and he was always a technician at the point of attack, and he was just so consistent. And I think there'll never be one like him, and I think people have been spoiled by having a player like that, because I think you just thought you could put it on his shoulders and he could do everything, and he could do a lot, but the injuries piled up, and here he is now, no longer with us. And it sort of begs the question, when should we have moved on? And should it have been possibly after the 2018 season? Now, that would have been a shock at the time, but you could have got a significant number of draft picks back. He still would have had 3 years on his contract, and at that point, probably tradable versus the market rate. If you take sort of the contract that Flowers got in Detroit, well into the 20s million. If you look at the numbers that Bosa picked up on his contract from the Chargers, obviously they're setting a new market rate. But certainly that contract was tradable at that point, and you could have got some goodwill. There was obviously injury history there. He'd missed games in the previous 2 seasons. So after coming off his first fully healthy season, that would have been an opportunity to move on then. I think you were always going to, if the team knew, and which we all did, that Watson was a guy who was going to have to get paid, and you'd have to reinvent the way in which you pay your salary cap, and they used that excuse for Hopkins, and again, a trade should never have been made, but the premise of it was fair. I think when you sometimes you have to give up players you don't want to give up, but you're building towards the future, and you were getting more cost controlled talent through the draft picks. If you got a number of high draft picks for Hopkins, I don't think anybody would have ever queried that too much. And the same with Watt. If you'd have got a number of picks from him to rebuild your defense, add something on offense, you could add an extra offensive lineman rather than going out in a crazy trade for Larry Tunsil. That could have been a good point then to do it. And say, well, actually, we've got Merciless, and we've got, it's pre-decline, but you've got Merciless, you've got Clowney, extend Clowney on a deal, and what move on. But I think all the stuff they did off the field, and the personality was, and how many jerseys he sold, never made that possible. And you think, well, why did they not maybe trade him at the deadline this year then? And you look at that contract, you're never going to get more than maybe a third at very late, third at best, 4th round pick. And I suppose you probably can't trade a guy like that means so much emotionally and psychologically to the franchise in the context of the terrible pennies on the dollar DeAndre Hopkins trade. So again, you go back to a number of decisions made, and what was, and it was it best for the football team to keep him on, pay that extra $8 million of his salary after the trade deadline, and not get anything back from him. And I think the previous mistakes made it a point that they wanted the positive PR and to treat JJ the right way, and I do get that. But if you're going to move on from, you've still got to build a roster for the next season tomorrow, and you could have got something back from now. They've done him a solid by letting him go and pick his team, but really, if they weren't going to extend him, and it goes back to the running of this team, and that Bill O'Brien and Jack Easterby had no clue, no plan, and they continue to look like they've got no plan. But if you weren't going to extend or restructure his contract, then you should have got something in return from him. To have one of the top 3 or 4 greatest players of all time just walk away, not because of injury, not because they're retiring, but just because you released him because, 1, you didn't plan ahead, and 2, you created a situation which wasn't conducive to winning football games. That the player can see that, and he's got limited years left to go and get a ring. And I think better run teams could have found a destination that he wanted to go and got at least something, or even a player, and traded him at the deadline back. But yet JJ Watt walks out with nothing. And if you think of Watt leaving, Clowney leaving, Hopkins leaving, if you'd have told, all Pro Bowl players in 2018, if you could have told me then that they would have all have left, and we would have got back a second, a third round pick, and David Johnson, who I expect the Texans to cut to save another $6 million on the cap. They're $4 million below it now with the cut of JJ, or the expected cap. This defense was the worst defense in the league with Watt. What are they going to be without it? So how on earth they fill this roster out to make them a serviceable unit, time will tell. But certainly a lot of soul searching and a lot of value free agents, and ultimately some draft picks and development of second year and third year, fourth year guys are going to have to come together in a way that's not going to make this defense possibly one of the worst ever to see a pro football field. But in a week where we see Easterby's power grow, or certainly the clearest indications of how strong his power is, we bring a more like-minded people of Easterby into the building, and we say goodbye to the greatest player that's ever worn him, and probably will remain, considering the Watson situation, for the rest of this franchise history. They'll probably welcome him back into the Ring of Honour, but a month after or so that your first inductee to your Ring of Honour, Andrew Johnson, speaks out against you, and he clarifies some of those comments in an interview, and he talked about he's concerned about the direction it's going, and he said he could bring out some examples, and he chose not to. But ultimately, what he said was he wanted players to benefit from his experience, and we've now got the full stop on JJ Watt's Texans career. Underachievement, just as Andrew Johnson was, and his point to Sean is, don't let that be you as well, and stand up when you think things are going wrong, and that's what he's encouraged him to do, and you can't disagree. But hopefully we'll come back prior to the free agency period and the start of the new league year. If there's no news before then, we probably won't have another podcast, but we'll definitely have a preview of potential free agents once we know the tags and the players have been re-signed in-house. We'll review that, and some of the guys the Texans could go after to try and plug some of the many gaping holes on this roster. Hopefully we'll have some more clarity on the Watson situation, but that one feels like it's got a lot of length to run. But thanks very much again for listening. You can check us out at podcasttexans.com, at podcasttexans on Twitter and on Facebook.